Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss New York's legalization of reproductive commercial surrogacy. My name is Taina Bien-Aimé, and I am the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. In June 2019, a letter signed by over 100 women leaders in New York was delivered to their governor, Andrew Cuomo, urging him not to legalize reproductive commercial surrogacy, a practice that grievously threatens women's health and violates women's rights to equality and also violates children's rights. The National Organization for Women also sent a statement to Governor Cuomo condemning the bill. In the last hours of the 2019 legislative session, and thanks to the outstanding courage of several New York State Assemblywomen, the law did not pass. The following year, the bill was again put forward. And again, New York women leaders, including Gloria Steinem, wrote a letter opposing the commercial surrogacy law. Survivors of commercial surrogacy and egg donation were scheduled to travel to Albany, the capital of New York State, to testify about their ordeals and urge New York to protect rather than unleash harm upon vulnerable mothers. And then COVID-19 erupted, paralyzing the world. New York became one of the world's epicenters of COVID-19 infections and record daily deaths. Districts across the state were desperate for economic relief and an approved state budget. And so, in the middle of the night on April 2nd, 2020, buried in a 400-page budget, Governor Cuomo legalized commercial surrogacy without the shadow of a public inquiry or a legislative hearing. The law came into effect on February 15th, 2021. 3 of those survivors who were prepared to testify before the New York legislature are here with us today. It is an honor to host them, and we are indebted to their courage. Other surrogacy and egg donor survivors were also prepared to share their ordeals with New Yorkers. These women and other survivors tell us that their signed contracts did nothing to prevent their myriad surrogacy-related chronic illnesses, their close calls with death, their mental anguish, and their sense of dehumanization. And then there are the mothers of young children from whom we will never hear. Brooke Brown from Idaho and Michelle Reeves from California, where commercial surrogacy is also legal. These women each died while delivering babies for contractors. The only reason why Michelle Reeves' death surfaced is because her husband organized an online fundraiser to pay for her funeral costs. The state has an obligation to protect its most vulnerable populations and prevent exploitation. In direct opposition to those ideals, with this law, the state of New York expresses its abject indifference to the health and safety of the most marginalized women. Medically, pregnancy is not a benign condition. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 810 women die every single day from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. Between 6 and 9 million more mothers experience serious related complications. These negative health outcomes have a compounded effect on women of color, especially on Black women, who are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications, in large part due to disparities based on systemic racism. For Native American women, the rate of maternal mortality is 2.5 times greater than that of Caucasian women. The CDC also estimates that 500,000 women experience life-threatening postpartum complications in the US each year, a disproportionate number of them being of African descent. 20 years ago, Governor Cuomo's own father, the late and great Governor Mario Cuomo, banned commercial surrogacy because he said it was harmful to the women whose bodies are used and to the children they bear. Altruistic surrogacy was allowed in New York. Commercial surrogacy contracts, he said, are unconscionable and therefore unenforceable. With this law, New York State lit a match to that human rights-based decision, as well as to a 2018 report indicating that in New York, there has been a 60% increase in maternal mortality over the past decade, underscoring racial oppression as a structural barrier to women's access to health and OBGYN services. Most European countries, plus Thailand, Nepal, Cambodia, China, among others that have banned commercial surrogacy, have done so because it commodifies women as reproductive vessels and engages in the sale of babies. the New York law mocks that progressive position steeped in principles of human rights and dignity. The survivors who are joining us today, Tony Baer, Jessica Allen, and Kylie Kiwatkowski, will not only share with us their lived experiences, but also warn us of the suffering that awaits vulnerable women in New York because of this law. But before I give each of the survivors the floor, and also I'd like to thank Lynn Savarese for these beautiful photographs of the survivors you have seen. I'd like to first start with Dr. Linda Kahn, an epidemiologist with extensive experience in examining maternal health and maternal morbidity. So Linda, thanks so much for joining us. And if you could just please explain to us lay people, what is involved in gestational surrogacy and what are the risks for surrogate mothers?
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much for hosting this. You kind of stole my thunder in a way by citing all those statistics about maternal morbidity and mortality in the United States. The numbers have been rising steadily over the past 4 decades, and we are one of the worst in terms of maternal morbidity and mortality in the developed world, and some of our statistics are comparable to those in less developed parts of the world. It is pregnancy is not a benign condition, as you said. The media glamorizes motherhood and pregnancy, but it is not safe. It is dangerous to women, and especially women of color. Not only low-income women of color. I'll point out that Black women, for example, even at the highest levels of education and income, are at greater risk of maternal mortality and morbidity than even the poorest white women in this country. So it really does come down to structural racism. But in terms of pregnancy itself, about 10% of children are born premature and or low birth weight in this country. About 3% have birth defects, and these affect children for the rest of their lives. And some of the maternal conditions that are associated with these adverse pregnancy outcomes for children are also common. Things like pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia, gestational diabetes. These have consequences for children. They also have long-term consequences for mothers, and they're not uncommon. Between 5 and 10% of women suffer pregnancy-related hypertensive conditions, and these put them at elevated risk not only during their pregnancies, but for the rest of their lives. Many studies have shown that women who experience these complications in pregnancy are at 2 to 5 times the risk of dying of cardiovascular disease for the rest of their lives. And we know cardiovascular disease is the greatest killer of women in this country. There's also a recent study that shows that women who suffer these complications are at increased risk of dementia. So we're just learning about the long-term consequences of pregnancy complications that are not uncommon even in naturally conceived pregnancies across the population. The issue with commercial gestational surrogacy is that on top of that, you are layering extra risk. Commercial gestational surrogates undergo in vitro fertilization, meaning that the pregnancy is conceived outside of their bodies and the embryo is implanted inside them, and then they carry that to term, ideally. And we know from women who undergo in vitro fertilization for their own infertility that there are increased risks of all of these complications above and beyond the baseline risk in the general population. So women who undergo IVF are at increased risk of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes. They're also increased risk of maternal morbidity and mortality, and their children are at increased risk of preterm birth and low birth weight, which in turn sets them up for a lifetime of increased risk of developmental disorders, of epilepsy, of cerebral palsy, of a host of other complications. Then on top of the added risk coming from using IVF, there's also an added risk because commercial gestational surrogates are carrying fetuses that are not biologically related to them in any way. We've all become experts at the immune system, you know, thanks to COVID. We all know a little bit literate about this now. And basically, the immune system attacks non-self invaders into our body. And pregnancy itself is in a way an invasion by a non-self. I mean, you're basically carrying somebody who's not yourself. But in a naturally conceived pregnancy, that fetus is half yours, so your body somewhat recognizes it. And in a naturally conceived pregnancy with a partner with whom you've had a relationship, there's some tolerance already built up to the other half. So while you are in a somewhat immune activated state during pregnancy, it's not life-threatening in general. Once you add on the use of, for example, we know from women who use donor eggs in their own IVF, so with their partner's sperm, but an egg that's not related to them, they have increased risk of pregnancy complications because their immune system doesn't recognize the fetus as being part of them. Add on to that, the commercial gestational surrogate has no relationship to either the egg or the sperm that created the embryo, and she's in an even more heightened immune responsive state. And this can cause inflammation that can also increase the risk of complications associated with pregnancy that again have lifelong consequences for her and for the children. Layered on top of that, we also have the condition that a lot of gestational surrogates experience, which is carrying multiples. In our country, because assisted reproduction is not generally covered by health insurance, people pay out of pocket and it's excruciatingly expensive. People often would like to have, be one and done. Implant a couple of embryos, have twins, and only have to pay for the experience once. This occurs in IVF with people's own embryos, and it also occurs in gestational surrogacy, which of course can cost up to 10 times more than an IVF cycle. So it is very, intended parents are oftentimes really pressuring surrogates to carry multiples. And this is associated with a very high risk of complications. Twins are adorable. We all, I mean, it's just sort of an amazing thing. When twins are born, we don't realize carrying twins is super dangerous. It's super dangerous for the women and for the children because, again, they tend to be more at risk of being born preterm and low birth weight. So we have so many layers of risk added on to the normal risks of pregnancy in the case of commercial gestational surrogacy. And women are not informed of these risks when they sign up to do this.
Well, thank you. And then we'll go back a little later as to whether this law, in fact, could protect women in surrogacy contracts, et cetera. So thank you again, Jessica, Tony, and Kylie for joining us. I hope that each of you can spend a little time telling your stories. We have some very short bios of your lives. I mean, as I mentioned before, each of your stories can last 45 minutes on its own. But let me start with you, Jessica, and building on what Linda said, which I'm sure resonates with you, but you had a very, very particular story to your commercial surrogacy experience. If you could just explain it to the public.
Well, about 5 years ago, I signed on to be a surrogate. Extremely long story short, pregnancy was, the first transfer failed. So I went in for the second transfer. That was a success. When I was 6 weeks pregnant, they found another heartbeat and they automatically ruled out that it was identical twins because they do tell you that an embryo is possibly it could split and turn into twins. So they automatically ruled that out. Pregnancy, by the grace of God, was healthy. Being I carried two, I was still healthy. I didn't get diagnosed with, high blood pressure, cholesterol, anything like that. me and the IP, we had an amazing relationship. I kept in contact with her as best as I could, sent her photos of sonograms, belly moving with the videos, and we really developed a great bond during the pregnancy. Fast forward to birth, I went in for a scheduled C-section. The intended parent was here. She ended up going into the operating room with me and sat next to me during the operation. So that was beautiful. They delivered the babies and automatically rolled them out. Stating in the contract, I was supposed to have a 1-hour visit with them before they left the hospital, and I did not get that. The IP was coming and checking on me every morning in the hospital. So I did ask her, can I see a picture? The first night, she showed me a picture, and I mentioned to her and my caseworker, I said, they don't look like identical twins. And the caseworker automatically stated that she too also carried a set of twins that didn't look identical at birth, but later on started looking identical. I'm under the influence of medication, I'm loopy. I didn't really think anything of it. I just, came out of operation. By the time the IP was getting ready to leave, I did ask her, I said, are you going to bring the babies to me so I could say bye? Sorry.
Okay.
She said no. That really broke my heart, as you could tell. I'm sorry. My son is 4 and this hasn't gotten any easier. So about a month later, she started sending me pictures of the babies and started asking me, do you know why they look different? And I told her, I said, I stated in the hospital that they don't look the same and nobody did anything about it. So she said that she was waiting for a DNA test so they could get ready to go home. They had to get a DNA test for their embassy to go back to China. And the DNA test came back that he didn't belong to them. So the caseworker of the agency automatically went and picked him up, took him under her care. I went and did a DNA test and he came at a separate time with her. She was supposed to make it there at the same time as I was. I thought I was going to see him that day, but she didn't make it. So the DNA test came back that he was mine. And then even after proof that he belonged to me, they wouldn't give me my son. I'm sorry.
He's with you though now, Jessica, so that's the happy story.
Oh man, I haven't had to talk about this in a long time. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry we're putting you through this. If you want to stop at any time, just let us know.
So it became a big fight. We couldn't find any legal help. No one knew what to do because they never heard of this type of situation. So we finally found a lawyer that took our case because they wanted us to sign a contract without legal representation. And she immediately told us, don't sign anything. So she sent them an email saying if they don't hand over my son, that they were going to create more damages than what they have already created. So it still became a big struggle. They were wanting me to pay all the money back. They were threatening me to, they were saying that they were going to adopt him out to somebody else because at that point I didn't have any say because the intended parents signed his contract. So they were legally his guardian. So they were just bashing me, bullying me, the whole nine. So finally, about 2 months, a whole nother month later, when he was 2 months old, that's when we got him.
and we got to see him before we went live, and he's a gorgeous little boy. Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing it, and I'm so sorry that it's triggering so much trauma. One element to your story that you didn't mention that's in the blurb, but that's also important, especially as we go to our next speaker, is the question of race. So your husband is African American, and you
Yes.
were carrying the embryos of a Chinese couple.
Yes.
And we can talk about that in a while, but the other example of cross-racial surrogacy, so to speak, is that of Tony. Tony, you're visibly African American, and you were carrying twins for a white couple. So if you could just briefly tell us your story, as comfortable as you are, but also, again, we have to remind ourselves that New York law would not protect stories like Jessica or yours, Tony. So let us know.
Yeah, and it's just, I talked my husband into we wanted to have a child of our own, and I thought at the time the only way that we could become pregnant is to do IVF, because I had some tubal issues. I needed to have a tubal ligation. We had experienced a lot of death on both sides, and so I was in a kind of a different place, bringing life into the world. And so I had the bright idea, why not bring life in the world for someone who was kind of in the same situation that we are, who want to have a child, and in return, they could just pay for IVF treatment. What could go wrong? It's a beautiful thing. Found this couple on Craigslist, of all places. I didn't know anything about surrogacy. I mean, just the unicorns and rainbows that everybody tells you about or put forth, that, it's what could go wrong. Craigslist, found this couple. We met them for dinner in person. We ate dinner with them. They sat across from us. We sat across from them. They could both see that my husband is of Caucasian race. I am of African race. We talked. Everything was perfect. They called us back. Oh, we want you to be the one. Okay. Well, what do you want in return? And we told them, we only want one cycle of IVF. That's it. That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's all we want. Going forward a little bit, there were some things that we spoke of that was going to happen. They were going to take care of all of the going back and forth to Chicago, because we both lived in the state of Iowa at the time. They were going to handle all the transportation of me and my husband going back and forth to Chicago, because they were using a fertility clinic in the state of Illinois in Chicago. And so we would drive back and forth there. My husband was going to be allowed in the room, 100% support from him. They didn't have an issue with that. Fast forward to the whole situation. It was his sperm, and they had an egg donor. So the intended mother had no parts in it at all. And once we got pregnant, and I had to skip through a lot because there were so many red flags that I just ignored, because you think everybody's heart's in the right place, that just maybe people are a little bit nervous of the possibilities of what could go wrong. I don't know. It angers me. I'm sorry about everything that happened, but I'm going to try to stay on focus here with what happened. I got pregnant, but things kind of slowly started changing before the confirmed pregnancy. They started backing out on my husband being able to go up there every time. So, but we kind of ignored that. Okay. He had to work anyway. So it's just the weekend that I got pregnant, It wasn't even the doctor that transferred the embryos in me. It was the woman that actually did the consultation with us. I didn't really know how before to give myself the injections, just a lot of different things that I look upon now that I should have known better. But once I got pregnant, almost immediately things changed between us and the intended parents. They kind of started treating me like they own me, basically. Matter of fact, they kind of said that in so many words in a long email. When the attendant mother said that this is their pregnancy, they are paying me. I have to do what they say. The doctor said that it's up to them what's supposed to happen, and just a lot of negative and hurtful things were said, to the point where I could no longer talk to the intended mother. I said, okay, I'm going to talk to the intended father because this is his sperm, and let me talk to him, because I didn't know if it was the fact that she felt a certain way because it wasn't her egg and I was carrying the child. I don't know. I can't continue to try to put myself in her shoes because it's way beyond that now. And mind you, this is like before I turned even 6 weeks pregnant. So things turned pretty nasty right outside the gate. By the time I was 8 weeks, I think right before 8 weeks, I started bleeding really bad. I had a subchorionic hemorrhage and I had to go to the ER. And it was determined at that time that I was carrying twins. And I told them, and you would have thought I had killed their dog. Who gave you the right to go to the hospital? I was supposed to ask permission to go to the hospital. Now, they weren't paying for anything because we were using my husband's insurance. So, but it was a bad thing that I did, and I should have got permission from them to go to the hospital. And that was one of the other reasons why I couldn't talk to her anymore. That was coming from the attendant mother. So talking to the attendant father, things didn't get any better. He told me that my husband was no longer allowed in the doctor's visit rooms with me, and just so many different things, to the point where me being the type of person I am, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? We didn't have attorneys when we first signed the contract, because again, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? I'm giving you life. All I want is just one cycle of IVF. It was going to cost $13,000 because we were going to go through the same clinic that they went through. We were getting a deal. But I started not trusting the process. I'm like, okay, if they're acting this way and they're contacting the clinic and bad mouthing me and bashing me, I can't trust them to do our one only cycle of IVF. What am I to do? So I contacted an attorney. And this is when I decided that I could no longer talk to either one of them. And the attorney said, okay, don't worry about it. He was going to take my case. I'll talk to them. I'll talk to their attorney. She's crazy. He was telling me all the right things that I wanted to hear. And it just got to the point where they would change their numbers and try to contact me from this, even when we were told not to contact each other. It was very stressful. I became a hermit in my house. I didn't trust people. I didn't trust doctors. I didn't trust people knocking on my door. They had people following us. They had a private investigator following us. I had notes left on my car. My husband had to get a second job to support me carrying twins. It was a lot. My experience was quite different from Jessica's as far as the relationship with the intended parents. It's very, very stressful, very, very stressful time, which should have been a very beautiful moment. And to make a long story even shorter, I only went to about 6 months gestation finally, after all these months, now mind you, this is from 6 weeks to about 6 months, no communications with the attendant parents, but there was people breaking into our house. There was so much stuff going on, so much stress, to the point where I finally had enough. The attendant mother finally got my email again, because I kept changing my email address. She finally got my email again, and she sent this long email bashing me, and I had enough. And I just finally asked her, it's like, what happened? What went wrong? What happened to the time that we met to now that is so bad? And it just went on, you were a liar, just all this bashing, to the point where she called me the N-word. She called me a nigger. And my husband got in and posted on Facebook, contacting my husband's sister, saying that he was a dirty effing Mexican and nobody wanted him. It was just a lot. And at that point, even after everything that was going on, the people breaking into our house, them stalking my husband at work, them contacting all of our family members, everything of that nature, I still was going to give the kids to them. Excuse me 1 second. One moment. I still was going to give them the kids. When they started talking, sorry, that's my little one, they're going back in. When they started talking the racist things, that's when I decided I couldn't give them the babies. I didn't know what type of household they were brought up in, but that hate is what pretty much broke the camel's back. And I contacted the police department at the time and said, I told them what was going on. I don't want to be a part of this contract anymore. And that was it. They left me alone for about a week. And I ended up going into preterm labor and having the babies. And I stayed in the hospital for months, but 8 days later, we lost one of the twins. And I stayed in the hospital from August into November until they were able to go into a courtroom without my knowledge and got papers trying to ban me from the hospital, saying that I couldn't have a relationship. Now, at the time, you guys have to realize the laws on the books in the state of Iowa were different. Surrogacy was legal, but gestational carrier was not legal. What we were all doing, which I didn't know, was committing a Class C felony. You cannot at the time sell a child in the state of Iowa. And that's what we were essentially doing, because it wasn't my egg. If it was my egg, I could do what we were doing, but so how can a court pretty much force us to commit a crime, which is what they did. But they pretty much they overturned their laws when we were dealing with all of this, and we took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it didn't do any good. So,
wow. Thank you, Tony. And for all of these survivors, you can find out more about their stories online, and especially legalized surrogacy, whynot.com, which is a very helpful website. So again, going back to the New York law, I mean, every story is their own individual story. And of course, our concern is that this law would not protect the women, whether it's in Tony's situation or in Jessica's situation. What people don't understand or don't necessarily know is that you need 2 women for what they call gestational surrogacy, an egg donor, in addition to the surrogate mother. And very little is known about egg donation and its dangers. And so I'd like to give the floor to Kylie to talk about her experiences as an egg donor, briefly, because we're.
I'm sorry.
No, so thank you for having me on here. So my journey started back about 10 years ago. It was 2011. And just like you, Tony, I had come across a Craigslist ad I was working at the time, but just somewhat freshly out of college, still paying college debt, still trying to figure out, financial situation for what I needed. And I hadn't had any children at the time, wasn't pregnant at the time, wasn't married at the time, and came across this ad. And I just said, wow, that's a great thing. You can help a family that wants a child. I'm not using my eggs right now, and it's kind of a win-win. I can make a little bit of money. I can help a family out. What could go wrong? This is perfect. And so I had reached out to the agency that was in charge and gone through the process of kind of creating a profile, and the agency just said, okay, we'll be in touch if a family wants to use you as the person that can provide eggs for them. And so she said, usually it takes a little bit of time, and we'll just let you know. So fast forward, someone reached out to me within a month, and she goes, oh, this never happens. This is just crazy fast. And you're just so, great and wonderful, and they want you. And so of course it makes you feel really good that you're wanted, and, you're just one of a kind, and, just the whole emotional appeal about it. So the family was in Canada, and they had said that unfortunately in Canada, it's not legal for egg donors to or to be paid for egg donors up there, which is why they were reaching out to the US. They told me at the time there was no legal issues with that because I was from the US. But again, that should have been a red flag to know, to do a little bit more research. So ended up having to fly back and forth from Canada to go to receive medication. Everything that was, I had to self-medicate, but I had to go to Canada in order to receive the medication. And then went through all the testing here. I flew for the procedure in Canada and just didn't feel good about it. They've given me a ton of medication. And I kept asking them, I'm just not feeling right. I'm feeling off. I'm feeling bloated and uncomfortable, and I've got these headaches and all this stuff. And they said, no, it's completely normal. You're fine. You're healthy. No big deal. And they were pushing me timing wise because at the time it was around winter and they were about to have a winter storm. And they said, if you don't do it now, we'll have to wait 6 months and they may not want you anymore. So we have to do it now. And so, so I was like, okay, we'll do it. And so I remember just it being a completely traumatic experience. They have you somewhat sedated, but you're awake during the procedure. And I just remember being really uncomfortable. And the doctor just was, nope, you're doing great. You're fine. And then once it was over, you went into this cold kind of waiting room until you woke up fully. And then they said, nope, you're on your way. And so you just felt like just an instrument and a product, and you're not even human. They didn't treat you like a human. And so sure enough, as soon as I left, my symptoms started right away. And I was throwing up on the elevator on the way leaving the hospital. And they didn't even take me back to the hospital. They just sent me on my way. And I was flying home that night and almost didn't even make it home. I had to keep running from the airport to the bathrooms, on the airplane to the bathroom. Sometimes I didn't even make it to the bathroom because I just was vomiting everywhere. And it was just horrific. So somehow I made it home and I didn't leave my bed for about 2 days. I couldn't move. I couldn't hardly, definitely not walking, not moving, couldn't drink anything, couldn't keep anything down. And my boyfriend at the time had called the doctor because he had said, hey, if you have any issues, you can call me. And so we called the doctor. He had called the doctor and said, what can we do? And he said, just give her Gatorade. She's just dehydrated. She just needs Gatorade. And he was like, she's not actually able to keep it down. She can't actually drink it. And so later that night, I went to, I'm laying on the bed and I went to grab my phone to see what time it was. And I actually couldn't move my arm. And so it was this kind of out of body experience. And I went to move my arm to grab my phone and I couldn't actually move my body. And so I went to try to push myself up and I fell off the bed. And so at that point, he called 911 because he wasn't sure what had happened. And I I wasn't actually making sense. I was slurring my words, nothing was coming out. And so what ended up happening is I got to the hospital and they had told me I had a stroke, and that they didn't know it at the time that I had had the egg donation procedure so quickly before that, but my abdomen had swollen so large that I looked like I was about 9 months pregnant, and it was full of fluid. My ovaries had expanded. Normally ovaries are the size of almonds, and mine had expanded to the size of about grapefruits, and some small melons. And they said that I was a risk of them bursting or them twisting. And had they twisted or bursted, I would have died immediately. And so they were trying to treat my stroke and giving me blood thinners for the stroke because they didn't want me to have another one. And then that was causing adverse reactions with my ovaries and internal bleeding and all that stuff that went with it. And so, again, long story short, I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks, had to have multiple blood transfusions, all the stuff that went with that, and almost died a couple of times throughout the process for multiple different reasons. Couldn't, just you had stroke issues, and then you had obviously just the ovary issues. And so finally, when they released me from the hospital, when I was out of the clear, I still had an at-home nurse for about 2 to 3 months that had to keep an eye on me, and I had drainage bags because my abdomen just wouldn't stop bleeding, basically. And so after all that, when we found out through legal channels, the doctor in Canada, well, let me back up. So the research that I had done said that for any intended parents, during one of those procedures, they will usually retrieve 6 to 10 eggs for a family when they're trying to have either an IVF situation or surrogacy, whatever that is. 6 to 10 eggs is what they will retrieve for a normal procedure. And then what we found out is the doctor ended up taking 45 of my eggs. And so they had given me so much medication so quickly, and they ended up harvesting 45 eggs. And so, of course, your mind goes to, well, that family doesn't need 45 eggs. What is he doing with all the other ones? And then you go into the legal side and the illegal side of what that means. And yeah, you sign them away and that's it. There's nothing you can do. So I've never spoken with the family that was supposed to receive the eggs. I don't even know if that family was real. There's just so many multiple things that are involved in that you just don't know. And there's no way to know. So, but yeah, that was 10 years ago. Now my husband and I are dealing with fertility.
Sorry, and then you also are open to talk about your own fertility now. Has that affected it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was just about to say. So my husband and I have been married for about 5 years, and we have been trying for 5 years. They say if it's possible for us to get pregnant, it will be immediately a high-risk pregnancy because of what has happened in the past. A lot of doctors won't even work with me from hormone things just because they said it's just too risky. And so we're kind of at the mercy of, trying to do kind of health things and acupuncture and, and my husband and I believe in God, and we know that obviously, if we're going to have one, we'll have one. And if not, then, that's kind of just what comes with, unfortunately, what happened and choices, I made pre all this. But there's not a lot that doctors will do. And I could push and go further into the hormone side, but it's something I will never touch just because of the experiences. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kylie. So going back to you, Linda. So there has been a lot of disinformation and misinformation about the law. For instance, that New York is one of the last states to legalize commercial surrogacy. That is not true. Actually, there are only about a dozen states in the US that have legalized commercial surrogacy. There are different regulations in different states. The second is that this is the strongest protective law of surrogate mothers, and probably the proponents of the law will listen to each of Tony, Jessica, and Kylie saying this could never happen with our law. And then there's the whole concept of informed consent. These women, is this the future of New York? And tell us a little bit about informed consent and contracts and how this law will or will not protect women as vessels.
Well, certainly anything that has happened in any of their cases theoretically could happen in New York. To take Tony's case as an example, one of the sort of foundational aspects of the law, which is called the Child Parent Security Act, and what it's really securing are the parentage rights of the intended parents over the child. And to do that, there's something called a pre-birth order of parentage that is issued to the intending parents before the child is born. It comes into effect somehow miraculously the second the child is born, because of course you can't be a parent of a child or parent a fetus or own a fetus that is inside somebody else's body, because we don't own other people in this country since 1865. So that's sort of the trick that they use to let that happen. But what this means is there's really no out for a surrogate from the time that she becomes pregnant until the child is handed over. The only way she can break the contract is to terminate the pregnancy. New York State is not allowed to forbid her from having an abortion, so she retains her right to choose to terminate the pregnancy up until whenever it's legal in New York, but that's the only way she can get out of the contract. So if she discovers partway through the pregnancy that the parents are not fit to be parents, that she doesn't feel it's in the child's best interest to be parented by these people, something catastrophic like the experience that Tony has, or let's say they find out that a parent, which has happened, all these things have happened, of course, that an intended father is a child sex abuser, for example, or there's a myriad of terrible things that a surrogate could discover about the intended parents. She can't break the contract. She's required to fulfill that contract other than terminating the pregnancy. So that is not solved by the New York law. And interestingly, the law does have slightly more structure to it than other laws in other states that have legalized commercial gestational surrogacy. It has something called, for example, the Gestational Surrogates Bill of Rights. And the Gestational Surrogates Bill of Rights includes her right to agree to multiple embryo transfers. Nobody should have the right to agree to something that is against the recommendations of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So there's a lot of loopholes, let's say, that remain in this law that put the surrogate's life and health at risk, but also are not fair to the child who ultimately may be born from this process. And another point that's in this law that is very upsetting is that the birth certificate that's issued at birth has the surrogate's name on as the birth mother, and then that is sealed. And a new birth certificate is issued with the intending parents' names as the parents. We just a year or maybe a year or two ago, I think it was just a year ago in New York, finally became one of the last states in the United States to allow children of adoption to have access to their sealed birth certificates, because we as a society have realized it is unfair for a human being not to know the identity of the person who gave birth to him or her or them. This is not respected in the case of commercial gestational surrogacy. Those birth certificates are sealed forever, and there is no provision for the child to have the right to access that information when they reach the age of majority. So on many levels, in terms of health and in terms of rights, there are still plenty of loopholes in this law.
But also the whole concept of informed consent, and this is not just a question for you, but for all three. And you know, the whole notion of consent is something that we hear a lot in our work to end violence and discrimination against women. We heard it in areas of domestic violence, in sexual violence. We certainly hear it in prostitution all the time. This concept of she consented. One of the assembly members said women love to be pregnant, feeding into stereotypes. The other part of the conversation that we haven't really touched upon are the economic inequalities, where you need at least $100,000 in disposable income if you want to hire or purchase both an egg donor and a surrogate mother. For what the average fee of a surrogate mother is $35,000 to $45,000 for 40 weeks of pregnancy at great risk. So can you talk to us about consent and all of the myths around how women are born to be pregnant? And if you're poor, this is a great way to make a living.
Right. That's super relevant right now in the era of COVID, because we all know women have lost their jobs at much greater rates than men during this epidemic. And either they've lost them because they've been, fired, or they have had to give up their jobs because they're the primary people providing childcare, and children are at home now. They're not in school. They need to be monitored while they're in remote school. So many, many, many women have been forced out of the job market right now. And it's not looking good in terms of them getting back in. And this is a way that women can earn money from home. It's very appealing in that regard. And even if it's only $35,000 to $45,000 pre-tax, remember all of this is taxable income. And that's something that surrogates and egg donors are not generally really informed about. They think the number looks big, but then after you pay taxes, it's not so big. Nonetheless, it's something. So women are making a choice to do this, quote unquote, but how much choice does a woman have if she has no other opportunities to earn money? New York State, we often forget, is very rural. Huge swaths of this state are very poor and very rural. And those women don't have a lot of economic opportunity where they live. They are women who may be very enticed by this because $35,000 to $45,000, even post-tax, goes a lot further out there than it does, say, in Manhattan. What is worrisome, however, is in these parts of the country of the state that are very rural, is there's also not a great access to medical resources for high-risk pregnancies or tertiary care facilities with really high-tech NICUs. And when these women run into trouble, or when the pregnancies run into trouble and the babies are born preterm or low birth weight, there's not necessarily the medical infrastructure to support that either. So that's worrisome. In terms of informed consent, just very quickly, for medical research, informed consent involves a very strict set of requirements by law. And so it's very clear that there's a lot of procedures that have to go into recruiting a participant into a medical research study, in which they have to be told about the risks known and unknown, the benefits. They have to be told that they can exit the study at any time. They have to have everything explained to them in plain English or Spanish or Chinese or whatever their native language is. They also have to be able to have time to consider it, to ask for more information, and they have to show that they are not being coerced into joining the study. And the problem is that when they talk about informed consent in this law, it does not meet those same criteria that we use for medical research. It's the kind of informed consent like a doctor says to you, oh, you know, do you mind if I take your blood because you're going to feel a pinch? Sure, go ahead, take my blood. It's not the same level of informed consent. And fundamentally, we don't know what the risks are in terms of long-term health and frankly, even the short-term risks, women are not adequately and accurately informed about the things that happened to Kylie, for example. And we absolutely have no knowledge of the long-term risks because no research has been done. And that has to be explained to women who enter into this, and it's not.
And also no state mandated registry to follow these women.
If they've set up a registry, it's a voluntary registry. It's not mandatory, and it's not a long-term follow-up registry. They're only collecting information on the specific cycles of egg donation and the specific pregnancies in surrogacy, but there's no long-term follow-up with the women built into this law.
Mm-hmm. So to each of the survivors, what do you say about consent and what do you say to New Yorkers? Hopefully New York legislators will listen to this and be as alarmed as we are, because this will also open, I mean, this is the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women hosting this. We have no doubt that reproductive tourism is going to skyrocket in New York. So what do you all think in the few minutes we have left? Although I think Mariana tells me that we can have an extra 15 minutes if you're available. Who wants to start? Jessica?
What I do really want people to know is the contracts, as we keep saying, they don't protect us. When we finally got our legal team after the whole media situation, that's why we went to the media, because we were searching for help. We couldn't find anybody. So when we finally got our legal team and they went through our whole contract, and that's when we learned that the contract don't even have anything to do with the agency. The contract was only just to protect the intended parents. And that right there is just, it's so completely backwards, because what about the surrogates? We are the ones that are risking our lives, our bodies, our health, you know, to give someone else a family. But in the long run, when something sideways happens, a nightmare gets created, they don't protect us. And also, they check us for everything, health-wise, psychological. They want to know every little detail about us from the inside out. But we don't get to know who the people are that we're caring for, such as the other young lady. She had no idea that these people that she was involved with were going to be the way that they are. We have no idea who the other side is. That's not right. We should be able to know the details of the people that we are getting involved with and caring for as well. So the contract, I've come to realize that the agency don't even know what's in their own contract. And that was like really mind-blowing to me. So these contracts, I mean, I know we're here to really put a stop to everything, but these contracts don't even make sense. They don't protect the surrogates. And it's not right, because when these nightmares occur, they automatically bash us. They attack us. They blame us for everything. They bully us, and they literally turn our lives upside down and create the worst nightmare that we could ever imagine. And that has to stop. We don't deserve this. For what we do, what we have chosen to do for anybody, and then we get these nightmares in our lives that we don't deserve, and then that's how we get repaid. It's not okay. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you, Jessica. Kylie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so to Jessica's point, it's to have consent, you have to have consent on both sides. You know, you think of it from a relationship, to have sexual consent, you have to have consent from both sides, understanding everything that goes into it. So if you're from a medical consent, you should know everything on the other side of what's happening and not just be almost a product or a commodity to them. You know, and to that point too, just bringing awareness to this is huge. You know, they've got such a huge presence, marketing presence of just pumping it into social media and to prey on these women who are in very compromising positions financially or emotionally or whatever that looks like, and taking advantage of that. And then you know, the work that you do as far as just human trafficking, if you look at it from a big picture, it's all connected. And I think if someone would have sat me down and explained the big picture of my part, that my tiny little part that I played involves this huge human trafficking, child trafficking, it's a whole industry. And if you can see the big picture and take a step back and see the part that you're playing, good or bad, I think it would raise more questions, and I think it would give pause so you could actually make a very well-informed decision before you step into something without knowing any of that.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. And so, Tony, why is it that people really don't care about commercial surrogacy? How, like for instance, one of the misinformation that the governor promoted is, since we have a Marriage Equality Act, we should give you know, gay men the right to have families. First of all, no one has a fundamental human right to a biological family. And secondly, the law doesn't even require you to be married. You can be one individual with very limited requirements for New York residency. So what will it take, do you think, to get people to understand about the harms of surrogacy? Is it that they just don't care about vulnerable and marginalized women? What is the deal?
I don't think it's the fact that they don't care, it's that they don't know. Nobody knows the horrors that can go into giving life. No one knows the horrors, because you have Andy Cohen's and you have the Burses, you have all these famous people, the Kardashians, doing it. It's like a new fad. So what could go wrong with giving? Like you said, they say, you know, women love to be pregnant. Well, I love to drive my car fast too, but that's not a good idea to do it. You know, I love to eat a bunch of food. That's not a good idea to do it. I don't think any, and I say this because of my situation. And yes, I'm going to be selfish, because consent contracts, they're all made to be broken. We had actual laws on the books in the state of Iowa that were changed doing what I went through. How is that possible? I mean, if they don't like it, it's just gonna, they can change it. So you can put anything in the contract. Nothing's going to, like, you know, Jessica said, nothing's there to protect us, because we're not the one paying the monies for it. You know, there's so many people that are being employed by this. You know, they don't want it to stop. What's going to finally get it to stop, and unfortunately, I don't even think that's going to get it to stop, is when women start dying, when they see that, you know, there's pimps having their females go in, 15, 20 people go in at a time to get pregnant to make money, you know what I mean? Or I don't know what has to happen to cause it to stop. The one thing I do know that has to happen is we as survivors, as the surrogates, as the gestational carriers need to stop being silenced. Because if I would have known the Jessica Allen story, if I would have known the Melissa story, Callie, I mean, even the egg donors, if we would have known their stories, at least I do, I know I never would have done it. I never would have done it. I mean, you have warnings on cigarette packages. You have warnings on drinking too much caffeine. Why don't we have warnings about what could happen if you carry someone else's egg that's not part of you biologically? I did not know that I could die from carrying someone else's egg. I did not know that that could affect my fertility by carrying someone else's egg. I wasn't told that. I wasn't told that. Let's not even talk about the bad stuff that happened with the couple, because no one can no one can say what could happen with people's emotions. But what about the medical stuff, the stuff that we should know about? Why is that so bad to tell us what could happen? I don't get it.
So Linda, in our final moments, what is the future for New York when it comes to this law and when it comes to marginalized women in New York? And also thinking about the predatory reproductive technology industry that's going to make a whole bunch of money from this law.
It's the reproductive technology industry, it's the law industry. There's a lot of law practices. The New York Bar Association is heavily lobbied for this law. I think that inevitably there are going to be abuses because that's human nature and money is involved. I fear for the health of women who participate in this industry just because of the structural inequalities in our healthcare system. There's a very interesting paper that talks about income inequality and maternal morbidity and mortality rates for Black women are directly related to income inequality. And in jurisdictions where there's higher income inequality, Black women do worse. And I don't know if there is a state in the country that's got as much income inequality as New York State. So for, Black women, I think rural women, I think, it's very clever. They don't allow women to become gestational surrogates who are actually on public assistance. That's sort of like, oh, we don't want to prey on poor women. So if you're on public assistance, you don't qualify to be a gestational surrogate. The bar is so low in terms of income for qualifying for public assistance that doesn't really rule out women who are still in severe need of income. You have a lot of, as Kylie mentioned, student debt. That's the biggest driver of egg donors is student debt, paying that off. And that is coercive. And I think for women who've been laid off from their jobs, women who don't have economic opportunities, this is going to be a very tempting thing. And I think that that's going to, especially combined with lack of information about or accurate information or complete information. And frankly, we can't give women complete information about the health risks because we don't know it, because it has never been researched, because there's no money to research it, that we're never gonna have fully informed consent. But even in the best possible situation, and we could have informed consent done the right way, these women are still vulnerable economically and may choose to do things that are not in their best interest because they have to. And that's very concerning.
Well, thank you all. We wish we could speak with each of you for another hour. I just wanted to thank you, Jessica, Tony, Kylie, and Linda for sharing your stories, and Linda, your expertise. We're here in New York. We will fight for the rights of all women, regardless of their economic status or race, and for the right not to be reproductively exploited. We hope that New York legislators, whose responsibility is to protect the vulnerable, will listen in. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. None of you are from New York except Linda and me, and so we thank you for sharing your lived experiences, your voices. We hope people are listening out there. We stand with you and every other surrogate survivor who has been brave enough to come forth. And so our work ahead remains steep, but we hope that not too many women will die or will be maimed forever before this law gets overturned, and that commercial surrogacy is once again banned in New York. So thank you all for listening in, and onward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taina, and thank you to all of you.